very good evening and welcome to Wednesday's Cross Question here live on LBC. You can, of course, watch us as well as listen to us on Global Player. On the panel with me tonight, to my left, Siobhain McDonagh, Labour MP for Mitchem and Morden. Alex Crowley, to my right, former political advisor to Boris Johnson during his time as Prime Minister, also worked on both his leadership campaigns and his London mayoral campaigns, and he's now running a campaign business called Shared Voice. Daw KC, criminal barrister, legal commentator and author of Justice on Trial, Why the System is Broken and How We Can Fix It. And over to my left there, Lord Daniel Moylan, Conservative peer and former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London. I could have a long conversation with you about my views on Transport for London at the moment, but that would be very self-indulgent, so I'll try and avoid the temptation.
It's fine when I live.
But if you want to... It really wasn't. If anybody would like to phone in on any aspect of today's politics, lots of going on today. Of course, Nicola Sturgeon, Jeremy Corbyn being banned by Labour from standing again. Lots of other questions that you could call in about too. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC with your question.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, let's kick off with Alex in Glasgow. Alex, what would you like to ask?
Hi there. My question is, what impact will Nicola Sturgeon's exit have on the SNP and the Scottish independence movement?
Alex Crowley, let's start with you, because I think this is quite an interesting question from a campaigning point of view, let alone anything else. How do you answer it, Alex?
If I was being flippant, I would say it would improve their prospects of achieving independence, because I think one of the legacy, when we look at it, the legacy of Nicola Sturgeon's time as First Minister is her stated achievement was to achieve independence. And she has failed to do that. And by constantly governing in a way that distracts from the issues that the people of Scotland care about day to day, such as the health service, the education service, the fall in life expectancy, she provided a huge distraction from those issues. And we've seen just
won every election.
She's won elections, obviously not disputing that, but the central aim of independence, it has not been achieved, and in fact we've seen the pro-independence movement reverse in the polls over recent weeks.
But overall, I mean, you look at the polls over the period of her leadership, I mean, they are better than they were at the beginning. And I think surely that's an achievement where she's got, you're right, up until the last few weeks, there was a consistent, I think, couple of years where the polls were showing a majority for independence.
They were now and then showing majorities. They were mainly related to, frankly, the Tory party and the Tory government in Westminster not covering themselves in glory. But their stated objective was to overturn the first referendum result in 2014. It's a bit of a theme in our politics, overturning referendum results. And they have not achieved that. And now the SNP have a big question. How do they move forward? Is their aim still to use the next general election as a de facto vote on independence? Or are they going to reconnect, if you like, with the ordinary concerns of Scotland and actually start to fix some of the public services that they have allowed to fall, in some cases, into disrepair?
Siobhain McDonagh.
I think I disagree with that. I hold no candle for Nicola Sturgeon, but I have to say you have to admire her abilities of communication, of tenacity, of controlling the message. I think she's done a job at that, accepting that some of the public services are pretty dreadful. She was able to stay there. The polls were still going her way. She's made errors, doesn't everybody? I can only see that actually there will be a setback for the independence campaign, because now she's going, the tensions that seem to exist in the SNP are going to come to the fore, and they will be highlighted in the inevitable leadership election that's
but it can be quite refreshing for parties to go through this process.
Oh, absolutely. I think they have to
revive them in some ways.
Yes, if there is somebody of great calibre who is there to be the next leader. That is not always the case, and I say that for all parties. I'm not being partisan there, and it is hard to see who is going to replace her, who is going to be so extraordinary at controlling the message and captivating people's imagination. And I think whoever replaces her has the hard work to do of repairing the public services that have fallen apart.
I must say, in the last hour, we had a caller, Robert in Norwich, who was saying that Scotland has sort of a bad education system, bad health service, drug deaths higher than anywhere else. And I immediately was assailed on Twitter by people, obviously SNP supporters, saying, why didn't you challenge him? And you're kind of saying the same thing here.
Well, I mean, I think Scotland has traditionally had such a fantastic public education system, and the importance by society as a whole to education has been great. And that's just not been happening. We've seen fewer poor kids get to university. We've seen money, in my view, not spent on tackling those inequalities, more giving money to those people who already have and perhaps should be paying a bit more for their education or a bit more for their social care.
Crystal.
Well, it's interesting. The question was a particularly interesting one, wasn't it? Because it was about the impact of Nicola Sturgeon's departure on the prospects for the SNP in particular, but also for independence more generally. And I think the straight answer to the question is that Nicola Sturgeon's departure enhances the prospects of both. Because I think people in Scotland and elsewhere, the Sturgeon-Salmond era is coming to a natural end, it seems to me. Nicola Sturgeon's been First Minister for many, many years. She succeeded Alex Salmond, and of course was his deputy. And I think, ultimately all politics and all political movements need to be refreshed, as you said a few minutes ago. And I think refreshing, I was slightly disappointed to hear that an entire Scottish population may not be able to throw up a good candidate to be First Minister. It would be very sad if that were the case, that there wasn't someone who was waiting in the wings to come through and actually really show Scotland in its best light.
I think if you look at the history of leadership elections from a number of the main parties over the last years, you will see that very often there isn't somebody. Well, I agree. I think that's no insult to the Scottish people.
You're absolutely right. And the bigger question, I think, for most people listening or watching will be, why do we have such a dearth of talent at the top of politics? Whether it be in Westminster
people like you don't get
or
involved,
in Scotland.
Chris.
Well, you make a fair point. Actually, why would anybody? No, you do, because
we're getting an announcement.
You make a fair point.
Is
because
modesty your strongest quality?
No, but why would anybody? And I don't speak for myself, but why would anybody who's a leader in business or at the absolute top of some other profession in the current climate go into politics in the way that politicians behave and the public discourse around politics? It's so negative and so poor that nobody in their right mind would go into politics these days.
I actually think it's extraordinarily difficult to be the leader of a political party in any time, and great leaders are few and far between. And for most of our history, I'm not sure that we do have great leaders. I've been reading a book by Dorrance Cairns Godwin, who's a fantastic American writer, about leadership, and in fact most of the time we don't have great leaders, that they are few and far between. And very often political parties of all shades don't necessarily have that.
Maybe what we need to do is to copy Ukraine and have a comedian as Prime Minister, because they seem to be doing rather well out of that at the moment. He's providing real leadership. I'm not sure which of our comedians, maybe that could be our final question today, which comedian would you nominate as Prime Minister? Daniel Moylan, what's your response to Alex in Glasgow?
I don't claim any special knowledge of Scotland, so I think it would be presumptuous of me to say what effect it was going to have on the Scottish electorate and the choices they make. I'm personally delighted that she's gone, because she has sought to break up the United Kingdom, the most successful voluntary union of peoples in the world, and one I belong to. It's my country as well. And she's failed to do that. And I'm thrilled that she's failed to do that. And I hope her successor will be less formidable, because I agree with Siobhain. She has been an astute and formidable politician. Everyone says she's left the country worse off in terms of education and public services and so on, and the electorate will have to make their choices based on their assessment of that. But I think what's also clear is that she has left the Scottish National Party in a state of factional divide that she has provoked, largely over this trans issue, but on other issues as well. And I think the Scottish National Party itself is going to have to work very hard to pull together and stay together, let alone choose a leader, given the very serious divides that separate them.
That's a very detailed analysis for someone who started by saying that you knew nothing whatsoever about Scotland.
I didn't say I knew nothing whatsoever. I said I didn't know. I wasn't going to speak for the people of Scotland as to what their electoral intentions might be in the light of this change in leadership. But I do know a little bit about Scotland, and certainly even at Westminster you see the factionalism, that is the bitterness that has divided the SNP at Westminster, where I work.
But isn't it similar
is
to the
profound.
Conservative Party in a way? You look at the way that over the past year you've got it's now divided between the sort of Liz Truss so-called growth agenda and what Rishi Sunak seems to be doing, which I can't really define, but there are two very different approaches there.
Yeah, of course, but
Presumably
all
there'll be
parties,
at least two
all
different
parties,
approaches
all
in the
large
SNP.
parties, we're going to come on to the question of the Labour Party shortly. All large parties are to some extent coalitions of people with similar but different views, and with similar and different approaches. You can add to that, if you want, an element of personal bitterness and real loathing, if you want to, as leader. That is what she has done with the SNP. And that, I don't think, has been a good move for her party. We saw it with the fight with Alex Salmond before it even got to the trans issue. A real personal bitterness. And now there are MPs...
I'm on her side over that one, I'm afraid.
And well, I don't know. Again,
Alex Salmond was sitting in that very seat.
I saw
an
him
hour
leave.
ago.
He was trying to get into my cab.
Well, at least it was only the cab. I'm not going to comment on... as I say, the choice between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, whoever, is one for the Scottish people. But all I'd say is there's been a real element of bitterness added there. We've seen it throughout her career. And I don't think it's done the party any good. I think it's put the party in a fragile condition. We'll just have to see how it resolves these issues.
Alex in Glasgow, what's your answer to your own question?
Well, me being me, I hope it leaves it in a rather bitter state. I do agree. Sorry, I quite missed your name there. The last statement there, I do agree that they've been left in quite a state of factional divide, and it will be very interesting to see who comes out on top. I think it could end up being quite a bitter contest between many people that we in Scotland might not know, or at least not know as well as Nicola Sturgeon, obviously. On the comedian point, I do stand-up comedy, so I'll volunteer for the job.
Well, I'm getting lots of nominations on texts and tweets. Many people saying, well, Boris Johnson was a comedian, so we've had one as Prime Minister. Alex, thank you for that. Paul in Paisley says, Angus Robertson is the only SNP candidate for leadership who does not have the personality of a dead fish. Well, that's a point of view. I'm thinking of some of the other candidates. I think that's being rather unfair on them. Some very sad breaking news that I can bring you. The Hollywood icon Raquel Welch has died at the age of 82. Now, she was someone from our generation, Daniel, who, I mean, what a stunning... I know you shouldn't judge people by their appearances, but she was judged by appearance, but one of the most beautiful women that the world has ever seen.
Yes.
That's all you have to say.
Yeah. She was... great.
She really...
And that QU in the middle of her first name was always so exotic. Raquel with a QU.
You're easily pleased.
Was just so exotic. So back in the 60s, we were really impressed by it.
We were. Right. We will come to more questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. It's 8:15.
LBC.
Have with us on the panel for Cross Question Siobhain McDonagh, Labour MP for Mitchem and Morden, political advisor to Boris Johnson, or former political advisor to Boris Johnson. Alex Crowley now runs a campaign business called Shared Voice. Daw KC, criminal barrister, and Lord Daniel Moylan, Conservative peer and former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London. Right, let's go to another question. It is from our old friend Sean in Concert. Hello, Sean.
How are you doing? How are you doing? I tell you
I'm
what
very well,
is,
thank you.
You know I'm Labour through and through, mate. Has Keir Starmer shot himself in the foot and done the biggest mistake getting rid of Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, let's go to Jeremy Corbyn's number one fan, Siobhain McDonagh.
Absolutely not. I'm glad he's finally made this decision. It was waiting for some time. I think he had no choice. Jeremy Corbyn has partly done this to himself in his refusal to accept the problems that Labour, I'm ashamed to say, had with anti-Semitism. And now it's up to Jeremy. If he wants to stand as an independent, he should do that. But he's not going to be the Labour candidate, which I think is absolutely the right decision.
It's a bit rich, though, isn't it, for Keir Starmer, who says today that he was appalled by the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and has apologised for it, and yet he was one of Corbyn's key lieutenants in his shadow cabinet.
To be fair to him, though, he stood out against anti-Semitism all the way along the line and made that very clear.
I don't remember that.
No, he did.
I mean, I'm sure he wanted to, but that there is such a thing as collective responsibility. And you look at what most of that shadow cabinet said, and it was, if any of them said anything, it was pretty minor compared to what you were saying.
Yeah,
you've been consistent on this.
Well, absolutely consistent, because I didn't feel there was any choice. I felt very, very ashamed of what was happening, and it was they were pretty bleak times. And the fact that Jeremy just seems not to be able to accept what happened or fully appreciate the damage that he did, I think he's made himself. It made it impossible for anybody to allow him to be the Labour candidate. You know, if you have a political party, you have to have rules, you have to have judgments. And I think Keir's absolutely right today.
But it could, if he does stand as independent, the seat could be lost to the Liberal Democrats, possibly.
I mean, the people of Islington North will decide who they want as their MP. But Labour has to be clear to the electorate in Islington North and elsewhere about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable.
Let's take a follow-up question on this from Anne in Ealing on a text. She says, as a Labour supporter, I looked on the Twitter accounts of John McDonnell, Zara Sultana and Richard Bergen a few hours after the Starmer speech today. Not a mention of Jeremy Corbyn. Why does the panel think the Socialist campaign group is staying so quiet on Corbyn being unable to stand for Labour at the next election? Do we suspect that they want to win an election after all?
I think they want to win an election. I also think they know that they are in a sticky position. To defend Jeremy Corbyn and defend his view about the lack of problems of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party would then put them in a very difficult position. And I don't think they're about to sacrifice their own political careers for Jeremy.
Crystal.
I think a Liberal Democrat MP would be a fitting end to Jeremy Corbyn's parliamentary career, quite frankly, because to have presided over, as he did, catastrophic electoral defeat and to have become an anti-Semitism enabler, as he was for many years, quite knowingly and deliberately.
He would deny that.
Well, no one who's actually analysed any of the history of what went on in the Labour Party under his leadership could possibly come to any other conclusion, quite frankly. I know for a fact that if Jeremy Corbyn remained within the Labour tent at the next election, the entire British Jewish community would rightly be utterly outraged and wonder how a party that's supposed to be progressive, is supposed to stand for decency at its core, could possibly allow such a state of affairs to prevail. As I say, I think it would be quite fitting for a Liberal Democrat to go into Islington, and then perhaps Labour can look at regaining it at the next election.
Alex Crowley.
He's absolutely done the right thing, but it does beg the question, as you mentioned earlier, Iain. It doesn't quite square with his record. He was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. He was part of the project, and if he felt at the time that what Corbyn stood for and enabled, I think that's the right word. If he thought that was so bad, Why did he stay? I'm imagining, for example, Siobhain, you would probably not have served in Corbyn's shadow cabinet for precisely these reasons, and absolutely right too. But Keir Starmer did. And so it's no use him saying now that, yes, but I spoke out against it a little bit at the time. That does tar him, I think. And he's done the right thing now. Of course, it's easy to do the right thing when you're 20 points ahead in the polls.
Does it not tar him even more than it might most as a former director of public prosecutions and a leading lawyer who would know that discrimination of any kind in any environment is not only morally repugnant but unlawful? That he sat there in those shadow cabinet meetings and said, if he said anything, didn't say anywhere near enough. I think that makes it worse.
Not just a lawyer, but a human rights lawyer to boot.
I actually think making this decision today is not as easy as you might think. I think lots of people don't want to take risks. A lot of people will have been advising him not to do it. So I am very pleased that he has bit the bullet and made the decision. But, you know, I don't think it can have been easy. I mean, for me, you know, I don't want to lose... It would have been
very easy for you.
Yeah, it'd been very easy for me. I don't want to lose any seat for Labour, and I certainly want the voters of Islington North represented in the best way that they possibly can. And I think there'll be lots of great young Labour candidates who want to stand there. I don't think that'll be the problem. But I know that other people were much more cautious about it.
Daniel Moylan, are you going to break the consensus here? I suspect not.
I'm going to shift the debate a bit, because could I broaden this out a little bit from anti-Semitism? Because this is not just about Corbyn's record on anti-Semitism, to which Starmer is reacting, but it's putting the capstone, really, on a move to expel from the Labour Party and to diminish the influence of the whole of what you might call the hard left, or the left wing of the Labour Party.
The momentum group.
The momentum wing, but there are other factions and whatever, and names and labels.
The trots.
But you over there, and those people had found a home in the Labour Party. And it's partly about a democratic voice, because while I strongly disagree with them on many of their policies, their economic policies, their social policies, the wokery and all of that, they have a say, in a sense, to a voice in politics. Their voice should not just be squeezed out of politics. So if they're not going to belong, if what Starmer is saying, we do not want you, we do not want your votes, you do not belong in the Labour Party, and your mascot, your iconic figure is now out on the trash heap as well. Where are these people going to vote? Because it shouldn't be for Labour, surely. They should be going off. What are they going to be doing when it comes to a general election?
Well, if we had proportional representation, they would be forming their own party,
we don't have proportional representation. But where are they going to find their democratic expression? And I think that raises a real question.
Well, they'll find it in the same place they always have, won't they? Which is Labour, because that's what happened in the past when the extreme left were diminished in their influence within the Labour Party. Those were the periods at which Labour came to power with huge majorities.
You know, they might find their influence in the Green Party or somewhere else.
But specifically, Jeremy Corbyn is prevented from standing as a Labour candidate because actually he's rejected the reports from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission. He's unwilling to accept what this independent body said on the basis of an independent review. And that's quite important.
Why can he still be a member
Jeremy
of the Labour
is quite
Party?
litigious, so Keir has to be very clear about why he's doing this.
But why not chuck him out of the party
he's
altogether?
Doing more as well. You're right. I understand why you want to bring this back to the anti-Semitism question, which is a very one.
Because it's why he's not going to be a Labour candidate.
On the can, but it's not just why he's not going to be a Labour.
It's exclusively why he's not going to be a Labour candidate.
Destruction of a whole wing of the Labour.
There are broader politics at play here. Over the last few weeks and months, Starmer has been in the process of clearing the decks. Right, he is getting rid of unpopular policies. He is clearing out unpopular people. Yes, the specific reason, you're right, Siobhain, it is about the anti-Semitism thing and his rejection of the report. But there are broader political reasons as well that are useful to Keir Starmer at this point. And I think Daniel's right on that. I think that it's clearly Starmer's aim to try and get rid of all of the objections to voting Labour at the next election. And part of those objections were
that's very sensible.
But if you're going to do that, do it properly and chuck him out of the Labour Party completely. Because he's still a member of the Labour Party, and Keir Starmer isn't questioning that. Why isn't he saying, well, we think that your views on anti-Semitism are not right, and therefore you shouldn't be a member of the party?
That's a very different. That's a thought crime type of scenario there, isn't it? It's very different. Someone standing officially in the name of a party for election
there's
to
other
Parliament,
things where
someone being a member of a party, which is a much broader
We've got
church
to stop Ukraine trying to invade Russia.
I think
that sort of thing, I think, is equally as reprehensible.
I think that shows weakness on Starmer's part. He knows that by not kicking Jeremy Corbyn out as a member, he's waiting for Corbyn to resign as a member to stand as an independent. I think that shows weakness.
Do you think it might also be because he may actually have advice that these things are quite difficult? So what he can do is not allow him to stand as the candidate because he's got a watertight case in terms of the anti-Sem and the EHRC, and he might have a less than watertight case over a wider issue. But
well,
you know,
it shows he has a good lawyer, not that he's a good leader.
But the fact that Keir Starmer wants to bring Labour back to the centre is fantastic because it gives us the opportunity to try to win, and I don't underestimate how difficult that is going to be, try to win the next general election because you win elections from the centre.
Well, you also win elections by doing things that are popular, and there's no doubt that Keir Starmer has been advised and believes that throwing Corbyn out as a Labour MP will be popular with the public and will give a positive glow to his leadership.
Let's give
That's
a
the only reason
semblance of balance to this debate, which we've remarkably not achieved so far. Stephen in Wales says, Jeremy Corbyn stood for the people, and the truth is that he scares the wealthy and powerful because he would have levelled the playing field. That's why he was vilified by the press. Well, if you want to redress the balance even further, we'll be talking much more about this after 9 o'clock. Very happy to hear from you if you think that Jeremy Corbyn does deserve to stand as Labour and Keir Starmer's made a mistake. Right, we are going to move on to other subjects in just a moment. Lines still open if you want to put a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30. That means Serena Farrow has the news headlines.
Lancashire police have revealed Nicola Bulley had previously struggled with issues with alcohol. Detectives investigating her disappearance also say they had visited Nicola's home for a welfare check just over 2 weeks earlier. Donald Trump has been scathing of Nicola Sturgeon's resignation, saying good riddance and describing her as a failed woke extremist. The former president criticised her as a crazed leftist, pointing out her backing of a controversial gender recognition bill. And Jeremy Corbyn says a decision to bar him from standing as a Labour candidate is a flagrant attack on democracy. Sir Keir Starmer confirmed earlier his predecessor won't be allowed to stand for the party at the next election. LBC weather is going to be pretty wet for the rest of the evening, particularly in the north, turning cloudy as well with a low of 1 degree.
LBC.
Siobhain McDonagh on the panel with us, Alex Crowley, Chris Daw and Lord Daniel Moylan. They're here to answer your calls, 0345 6060 973. Let's go to Eric in Enfield. Hello, Eric.
Good evening, guys. Good evening, panel. My question is quite simple, actually. Do the panel think by pushing ahead with the ULE expansion that Sadiq Khan is sealing his own faith as London Mayor in the next election, which is in May?
Well, Sadiq Khan has tonight told LBC's reporter Fraser Knight that he's not afraid of having to fight next spring's mayoral election on having expanded ULEZ since the last one was fought on having introduced it. And Boris Johnson has today joined the calls for the expansion to be delayed. The plans for the current ULEZ were first drawn up while Boris Johnson was mayor, but were actually introduced in April 2019 under Sadiq Khan and was then expanded to the current area in October 2021 after he was re-elected for a second term. Well, Daniel Moylan, this is something that I imagine you know quite a lot about.
Yeah, well, I have an amendment down to a bill in the House of Lords which would actually give the boroughs a veto over this, so that boroughs would have to be consulted about it, because it obviously has drawn huge flack. I think it illustrates really that Sadiq Khan doesn't actually understand Outer London, because he looked at the extension of ULEZ, or the creation of ULEZ in Inner London, and saw that it went through and people didn't really make a fuss about it. I mean, so why would it be different in Outer London, he probably asked himself, without recognising the huge differences in terms of public transport provision, attitudes, participation, how many people in Outer London don't feel part of London.
And we should make clear this is something that's going to affect other cities in the country as well. It's not just a London issue.
It's not just London, and my amendment is not just about London, and about other cities as well. But it also has this knock-on effect into the surrounding counties, which he doesn't seem to have taken account of at all. It's a bit like his, at one stage he was proposing to have an entry charge into London for people. And now those people won't vote in the mayoral election, so they won't affect the outcome, the ones who live outside London. But the people in outer London, many of them are going to see their lives quite seriously disrupted. How many of them? Well, it depends how many have cars that are affected by the ULEZ charge, of course, and that won't necessarily be the majority of people in outer London. But they feel very acutely that something is being imposed on them that they haven't asked for and that isn't to their benefit, and it's causing a very wide sense of resentment in outer London on a scale I haven't seen for years, the way this hornet's nest that he's provoked.
Well, it is interesting. We did a phone-in on this, was it yesterday or the day before, and the lines went mad. I mean, this is something that really has caught on with people. But I wonder whether everyone understands exactly what it is, because I think people are thinking, well, it's any car, is it before 2015, something like that?
Whether it's a diesel or a petrol.
Diesel 2015, but petrol is 2005. So there is an opportunity there to switch from diesel to petrol and not be penalised.
It's the diesel car owners particularly who feel penalised, because a diesel car lasts longer than a petrol car, I think, and many of them still have them and they use them. It's the vans and the people like that, and it's also the fact that you're crossing, these roads you're crossing, and you haven't got alternatives. It's always they'll take the bus. The alternatives, especially rail. And tube, are not as available in outer London as they are in London.
Well, Siobhain, you represent a borough which I guess you could broadly class as slightly outer London.
Oh, definitely, yes.
And you were part of our programme last night with our reporter Henry Riley, who I think interviewed you about your views, and you were one of 4 Labour MPs to ask Sadiq Khan to think again and delay it for a year. I imagine you might have got a little bit of flack from that within the party.
Do you know, I haven't. I don't know why people just leave me alone, but they do. But
you're lost cause.
I mean, it's just, for me, it's not about what the electoral consequences are. It's about the people who are actually going to be really affected.
Just give us a couple of examples of your constituents who've come to your surgery or written to you saying, look, this is how it's going to affect me.
Yeah, Elaine. She's a carer for her elderly mum and
dad. You sounded like Keir Starmer then.
I've known Elaine for 30 years. She lives around the corner from me. She cares for her parents. Her sole income is carer's allowance, which is roughly equivalent as to how much the ULEZ will cost her for the week. She takes her mum to the GP, she takes her dad to the hospital, she takes them out for a drive round Richmond Park to give them something to do.
You can't just switch to a petrol car?
She
Petrol's cheaper,
she does not have the funds to
enough the
buy
money.
another car.
This is it.
So, because what this is doing, it's taking a really good. Who wouldn't want to clean the air?
She's never going to change her car again. This sounds like a slightly improbable scenario.
Well, if you want to meet Elaine, I'm happy to introduce you.
I'm not saying that she's not saying that. I think
her.
you just need to advise people that the most important thing in London are children's lungs. Not with all due respect.
I kind of think you need to come to my constituency and talk to some of the people I'm talking about. These are people who are dealing with double-digit inflation, gas and electricity rises, council tax rises, water rate rises, increase in food prices, and this is just another charge that they're going to have to face. It's causing problems for small businesses. A community nurse who contacted me, she uses her car to go between her patients, and she's not able to afford to change to another vehicle. So her job is at risk.
But there is a point here that if you have, say, a 2012 diesel car, you could sell that and buy a 2012 petrol car and not lose money.
How much do you think you're going to get for a 2012 diesel car in London just at the moment?
Well, second-hand car prices are actually quite high at the moment.
I assure you, those who are not going to meet the Eulers aren't going to be worth absolutely anything.
Second-hand car prices
and people are. They just feel
you could make
overwhelmed
this argument even if these
by it.
vehicles are literally killing children every day. You can make the same arguments you're making now.
We have to decide. When we change public policy, when we have green policies that we all support, I believe the people who should pay for them are those with the broadest shoulders. This is a policy where those who are going to find it most hard are shouldering it. And
what's the alternative to clean up the air then?
There are huge numbers of alternatives, and some of it involves the central government. Now, I understand that Sadiq will be in a bind because he can't get central government to support him. He can't. The things that are not open to him to do. But I'd put a levy on people who wanted to buy big gas-guzzling cars, and I'd spend that on reducing air pollution. I would get
How do you reduce air pollution like round the South Circular unless you actually stop cars going round the South Circular? There is no other way of doing it. Unless car manufacturers produce clean cars, which, you could argue electric cars, well, there's even a debate about that now as to whether electric cars are as clean as they say. But there's this new clean petrol that apparently is being developed, which doesn't emit any CO2 emissions. So it may be that the technology saves it. But, Chris has got a point here, hasn't he? Because I was talking it's the 10th anniversary of the death of that little girl, Ella, and I talked to her mother on the programme with him. She actually rang in. She heard us talking about it. And you think, well, for every Ella, there's probably another 100 or 200 each year that we never hear about. And, it's all very simple to say, well, we've got to think of the children, but we do, surely.
Yes, that certainly we do. And certainly it's absolutely laudable of Sadiq that his main thrust is to try and clean London's air. What I'm saying is that the people who are being targeted at the moment in an unprecedented cost of living crisis are least able to do something about it.
Okay, Crystal.
That's a completely different point.
It is my point.
The problem is that the consequence of your argument is that these people continue to drive diesel cars, which pollute the city and destroy the health of children and people with respiratory conditions. So you have to get those cars off the road somehow. This seems to me the clearest and easiest way to do so as quickly as possible. And I suspect that actually in the end the cost of changing from an equivalent diesel to a petrol car will not be so prohibitive that the people you've described won't be able to drive.
Alex.
One of the biggest pollutants in the City of London and elsewhere has nothing to do with transport. It is the wood-burning stoves that all the wealthy middle classes like to install in their renovated houses that they bought for quite cheap in the 80s and 90s and now have benefited from the huge increase in house prices. There's a great series in The Guardian, the left-wing bastion, that regularly runs stories about how polluting these things are. That's got nothing to do with diesel cars.
But it was in the house before I bought it, so I plead not guilty.
Indeed,
and it leaks, so I don't use it anymore.
I don't hold you to account for that. And I'm not saying this flippantly. It is true. It was one of the worst pollutants in terms of air quality in London. It's got nothing to do with road transport. I accept completely that obviously over time you don't want to have rattly old diesels running around splurging out fumes. Of course you don't. But what Sadiq Khan is doing is he's doing this kind of cliff edge and saying, right, it changes from this day and it's going to cost you a fortune to change, instead of... he's meant to be a Labour mayor. He's meant to be nominally of the left. He's meant to hold the same general economic outlook as Siobhain there, who you rightly say in these measures should be borne by people who can afford it. Why can't we transition to cleaner vehicles? Why can't there be some financial help offered by TfL and the GLA to people who can't afford this? And let's not forget the impact on small businesses. Why do we wonder about the lack of economic growth and prosperity in this country when routinely we impose all sorts of costs on the very businesses that employ people? We say we decry the death of the high street. Look at the high streets in outer London. I'm sure you've got them in your constituency there. What about those businesses who rely on, they'll perhaps have one van for their deliveries? Yes, it's probably quite an old van because they haven't been able to afford to upkeep it. They're, by the way, facing a corporation tax increase as well in April. What are they supposed to do? If we want to get our economy back, we have to stop imposing these costs on businesses.
Right. Very spirited discussion there. I suspect we will return to this at some point. Coming up, though, we are going to talk about the teacher strikes. It's 8:46.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
That's the Queen Consort will wear a recycled crown at the coronation that will not feature the controversial Koh-i-Noor diamond because of its colonial associations. Raj is in Kingston.
They should go even further by sending it back to India. The Koh-i-Noor may be worth a few £1 million, but the benefit that you would get in terms of the friendship and the trade deals with India would be 100 times more.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC.
At Lloyd's
McDonagh, Alex Crowley, Chris Daw and Daniel Moylan here answering your questions. This is a text question from Kelly in Manchester. Teachers are going on strike again in March because they're not being offered a pay rise. Are they, they are actually being offered a pay rise, but not one that they think is good enough. Are they really being fair in disrupting my kids' education again like this? Chris Daw.
Well, I was a victim of strikes as a comprehensive school pupil in the 1980s when there were a series of strikes, which meant that we weren't at school for some of the time. We were sent home often at lunchtime, and the teachers...
And look at you now.
Well, the teachers were utterly demoralised, is the truth, then and now. And that's the reason they're going on strike, because of a complete lack of morale in the profession, because of shrinking numbers of people wanting to enter the profession at the salaries that there are. And I'm afraid that when teachers are demotivated and demoralised, as they were when I was a teenager and at secondary school, and as sadly they are now, children are suffering every day as a result of that demoralisation anyway. And unless teaching salaries catch up to something which will attract and retain talent with a high level of morale in every classroom in the country, I'm afraid the questioners' children and my own children and other children around the country are going to suffer for these strikes. But that's not the fault of those teachers striking, in my opinion. It's the fault of systemic failure to invest properly in education, and unless and until that happens, particularly in relation to the recruitment and retention of teachers, the standards of education in our state schools is going to fall.
Well, Kelly, you need to make sure you're listening in this hour tomorrow, because we have Niamh Sweeney, who is from the National Education Union, coming in to take calls from listeners. So maybe you can phone in and put that question to her. Did you take part in the barristers' strike recently?
Yes.
Did that work?
Absolutely. As much as it could have done. I mean, people think that barristers got, or those doing legal aid defence work, which is what the strike was about, got this huge 15% pay rise. In fact, that left those doing that kind of work about 15% in real terms behind where they were 20 years ago. So that 15% was making up a 30% shortfall, rather than actually, in real terms, being any form of pay rise. But at least it got the courts working and open again, because otherwise, I suspect that waiting times would have gone up even more than they already are. Some people waiting to give evidence as victims of rape for up to 3 years, and that system was on its knees, and I'm afraid education's going the same way.
Alex?
Well, look, as a parent, I have a huge respect for the teaching profession, and I know from my own daughter's school that they would not have taken strike action lightly at all, and I think that's the same for a lot of public sector workers, whether it's the NHS or anywhere else. So that's the first point to make. However, because we are in a period of unprecedented inflation, everyone, whether they're in the public or the private sector, whether they're a barrister, teacher, nurse, or etc., is in a situation where their real wages are not catching up with inflation. And that is a problem for everybody. And we cannot have a situation where the response to that is everybody goes on strike, because then the country stops functioning. That is not to say that individual sectors shouldn't stand up for what they believe is fair. That is their right.
So how do you stand up if you don't strike? What's the alternative? That's the question, isn't it?
Well, and I think it's a fair question. Personally, I don't agree with strikes, but I respect the right of the ability to strike, and I also respect the fact that that does, in the end, bring pressure on the government. You can well see a situation where the government will end up having some form of one-off payment for the various sectors to make the problem go away. We've seen this in London with the tube. That happened. There's a reason why tube drivers are some of the best-paid public sectors in the country, is because they have the ability to grind the system to a halt. But that cannot be the basis of a functioning system long term.
Okay, Daniel Moylan.
This is what happens when the Bank of England lets inflation get out of control, because people...
Because it's all the Bank of England's fault.
Well, the Bank of England is responsible for inflation. It says it on the can. That was decided by Gordon Brown, and that's their responsibility, their prime responsibility. They've let inflation get out of control, and I have sympathy with people who say, I want the compensation for that. I want my wages to go up in nominal terms, at least, to match the loss of earnings, practical earnings, that you get when you see high inflation. And that's the root cause of this. So I actually have sympathy with people who demand that. At the same time, I have to say, the government's in a place where sometimes it has to say, but we can't afford that. And I think that's the balance you have to strike. I think Alex makes a very serious point, though, about the disparity between those who, mostly in public sector and ex-public sector type activities, who have unions because of still the monopoly type characteristic of the supply of labour, have the power to go on strike and hold the country to ransom, and those who don't. And that is a disparity. There is a social disparity. And if you're working in transport, working on the railways, you can actually force something out of the government. And if you're not, if you're working in a shop or whatever else it might be, you don't have that power. So there's an equity question here as well as an affordability question in how the government responds. And I think they've got to, it's really, really difficult for them.
Siobhain.
I think it's really sad that the teachers have gone on strike. I think so many, particularly poorer kids, are so far behind because of lockdown that it's really tough. But I don't believe the teachers are striking only because of the last period of inflation. I think their frustration goes back to 2010 and George Osborne using them as the whipping post for the whole austerity thing, cutting back on local government. And people, it's now over 10 years since they've seen any significant pay rises. So I think it's an accumulation of frustration over so many things. And surely the government should just sit down with them and talk to them.
Well, they have been sitting down today, apparently, and didn't get anywhere.
Negotiate. The point is, any union is going to make a demand. It's the government's job to get to a position where both sides can agree.
Okay.
But there seems to be...
That can't happen, can it, because of inflation? And the fact is that many teachers, particularly young teachers, can't afford to live. They can't pay the rent. They can't buy enough food.
Right,
so striking isn't like a choice.
I want to squeeze in one more question, and we haven't got much time. It's from Bernard in Chesterfield, who says, should a murderer ever be released from prison if they fail to reveal where they buried their victim? And this is on the back of this case of the convicted murderer Russell Causley, who was released from prison today. He killed his wife Carol Packham in 1985, but has always refused to reveal the whereabouts of her body. Chris, I'm coming to you first again.
The answer is yes. Anybody who's serving a life sentence and reaches the end of the minimum period that the judge set for them to apply for parole should be released if they meet the conditions for parole. And the conditions for parole relate to their danger to the public, not to whether they have given information about the crime that they may have committed in the past. It's not a factor in the parole decision. Well, it may be a factor in terms of risk, but ordinarily someone who's served their time and is safe to be released should be released, and I don't believe that they should be kept in prison because they won't reveal information.
Siobhain?
I've had a similar case in the constituency, case of Jane Harrison, who was, her partner was convicted of manslaughter and her body has never been found. And I've seen the terrible impact it had on her parents, and it now has on her sisters. And it's really destroyed their lives. And I thought when Helen's Law came in on behalf of Helen McCourt about her daughter, that it was going to be very difficult to get released if you didn't give up where the body was. I think there's certainly an argument that you shouldn't receive any reduced sentence, that there should be a way to try and disincentivise the kind of unwillingness to say where the body lays, because it's about the victim, but it's about so many more people.
Right. Alex and Daniel, I'm going to have to ask you to be very quick.
I can't improve on Chris's response. I just say this: if somebody's been in jail for 30 years and they haven't revealed the information, why is keeping them in jail another 2 or 3 years going to
punish them for it?
It's to punish, and the punishment has been served. There has to be a determination. There has to be a point at which the punishment ends.
Alex?
You could look at it another way and say, how can we perhaps incentivise with the range of sentencing to reveal the information that would provide some comfort to the victims?
Good stuff. Final text question from Simon in Brixton. McDonald's is putting up prices on 4 of its burgers. Nightmare, says Simon. So, panel, which fast food chain is your go-to? Alex?
McDonald's.
KFC every time.
Siobhain?
Burger King.
Yeah, I'm more of Burger King than McDonald's, but Five Guys. Have you ever been to
Yes.
Five? Oh,
That's mid-market. That's posh fast food.
Yeah.
Very posh, yeah.
Daniel?
I have been to McDonald's twice, actually. And most recently, about 5 years ago in Stockport, where I was astonished at how cheap it was. And I completely understand why people go to McDonald's. And all these people in the House of Lords who are constantly making speeches about how poor people mustn't eat crappy food. Of course they're going to go to McDonald's. It's fantastic value.
Are you lobbying for a McDonald's franchise in the Lords?
No, they would definitely have Five Guys. When someone said to me, "Have you ever had a Five Guys?" I did wonder what they were talking about. But hey, luckily we finished the end of the hour. Thank you very much to Siobhain, to Alex, to Chris, and to Daniel. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to return to the subject of Jeremy Corbyn, who won't be a Labour candidate at the next election, says Keir Starmer. I want to know whether you think that's the right decision on behalf of the Labour leader, or is it something that he might live to regret? Because Jeremy Corbyn could be a real thorn in Labour's side over the coming weeks and months. There's also rumours that he might stand to be Mayor of London, which could jeopardise Sadiq Khan's vote, I suppose. So what do you make of this? Is it a show of strength by Keir Starmer? Do you respect him for what he's done? Or do you think, well, hang on a minute, you were in his shadow cabinet for 4 years, you wanted him to be Prime Minister? 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, detectives investigating the disappearance of Nicola Bulley have revealed she had issues with alcohol. Lancashire police say they'd previously been brought on by her ongoing struggles with the menopause. LBC's Jess Reeves has the details.
Lancashire police say they feel it's important to expand on what they meant when they mentioned vulnerabilities in a press conference this afternoon about their investigation into missing Nicola Bulley. In a statement, they say as a result of the issues, a response car staffed by both police and health professionals attended a report of concern for welfare at Nicola's home address in January.
Nicola Sturgeon has admitted she's become a divisive figure in Scottish politics following her shock resignation. The First Minister says she'll stay in office until the SNP's chosen her successor. Former First Minister of Scotland and former leader of the SNP, Alex Salmond, who's now leader of the Alba Party, told LBC that she's left in the middle of a double-edged strategy.
To get an independence vote. She said she was going to go to the Supreme Court. I thought it was a bad decision, but she went, got knocked back. And then she said she was going to have a de facto referendum in the general election, which would be next year. So it seems that, what shocks me is it's an extraordinary political time in midstream. And in that sense, she's left her successor as a party without a strategy as well as one without a leader.
The family of the head of Epsom College, found dead on school grounds, has paid tribute to her and her daughter. It's believed George Patterson killed his wife Emma and their 7-year-old daughter Letty before taking his own life. The family say Emma and Letty were inseparable and take comfort in that they'll remain so. And tributes are being paid to the actress and sex symbol Raquel Welch, who's reported to have died at the age of 82. She shot to fame in the 1966 movie 1 Million Years BC. LBC markets report the FTSE 100 surpassed 8,000 for the first time in its history. The share index closed up 43 points at 79.97. The pound buys $1.20 and €1.12. LBC weather pretty wet tonight and a low of 1 degree. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Serena Farrow.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
3 minutes past 9 on LBC. It's going to be Groundhog today in this hour, but we're going to talk about Jeremy Corbyn, something that we probably haven't done very often since he left office as leader of the Labour Party. When was it? Back in 2020, April 2020, wasn't it? Well, today, Keir Starmer has said that Jeremy Corbyn will not be a Labour candidate at the next general election. Now, he was suspended from being a Labour MP and he now sits as an independent because of this row over anti-Semitism. Corbyn had hoped to be readmitted to the Parliamentary Labour Party so he could stand for re-election as a Labour candidate in Islington North. Well, that's not going to happen now. And I've just been handed a statement that Jeremy Corbyn has issued. He says, ever since I was elected as a Labour MP 40 years ago, I've fought on behalf of my community for a more equal, caring and peaceful society. Day in, day out, I'm focused on the most important issues facing people in Islington North: poverty, rising rents, the healthcare crisis, the safety of refugees and the fate of our planet. Keir Starmer's statement about my future is a flagrant attack on the democratic rights of Islington North Labour Party members. It's up to them, not party leaders, to decide who their candidate should be. Any attempt to block my candidacy is a denial of due process and should be opposed by anybody who believes in the value of democracy. At a time when the government is overseeing the worst cost of living crisis in a generation, this is a divisive distraction from our overriding goal to defeat the Conservative Party at the next election. I'm proud to represent the Labour movement in Parliament through my constituency. I'm focused on standing up for workers on the picket line, the marginalised and all those worried about their future. That is what I'll continue to do. I suggest the Labour Party does the same. Well, you could argue that's defiant. It indicates that he probably will stand as an independent at the next election. Or you could say it's tone deaf. Not a single word there about anti-Semitism, not a single word about the Equality and Human Rights Commission statement today. Well, Keir Starmer was speaking to reporters this morning about the Equalities and Human Rights Commission investigation into the Labour Party and the anti-Semitism which has taken place within it. So Keir was asked to confirm if Corbyn will be allowed to run again as Labour's candidate in Islington North.
Jeremy Corbyn will not stand for Labour at the next general election as a Labour Party candidate. What I said about the party changing, I meant, and we are not going back, and that is why Jeremy Corbyn will not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election.
And he had a message to those unhappy with the way he's reshaped the party.
The change that we've brought about is substantial and it is permanent. The Labour Party has changed. And if there's anyone in the Labour Party that doesn't like that change, then my message to them is very clear this morning. The door is open and you can leave.
Now, listen, 2 weeks ago, Jeremy Corbyn himself sat down with my LBC colleague Lewis Goodall for an extended interview on the global original podcast, The Newsagents. And Lewis asked Corbyn about his ongoing suspension from the Labour Party in Parliament.
It's disgraceful. It is absurd and disgraceful. I've been a Labour MP since 1983. I've been elected every election since then, obviously, 10 times. And I've been a Labour Party member since I was 16 years old, and I was elected as a Labour MP by my very loyal constituents in Islington North, and I think the whole thing is absurd.
Jeremy Corbyn speaking to the Newsagents podcast. You can listen to and also watch that full interview on Global Player. And the man he sat down with for that interview, LBC's Lewis Goodall, joins me now. Lewis, very good evening. He was quite defiant in that interview, wasn't he? And wasn't brooking any of your nonsense about anti-Semitism at one point. I think he nearly walked out, didn't he?
Well, I think he didn't like the one particular line of questioning where we put to him what David Baddiel, obviously one of Britain's most well-known Jewish people, had said about Jeremy Corbyn, even though actually what Baddiel said is actually pretty measured, I think. You know, he was basically saying that he didn't think that Corbyn himself was an anti-Semite, but he did think that sometimes, as many of us are about different things, we do have blind spots about particular areas. In his case, Baddiel was saying, because of the particular type of politics and worldview that Corbyn has long had. Look, I think the thing is, what it reminded me of, that interview, Ian, was it reminded me of that time when anti-Semitism was so, and the anti-Semitism story was so prevalent in the headlines, and interviewing Jeremy Corbyn at the time a lot about it. I think one of Corbyn's biggest problems was, in a way, it's the flip side of one of his greatest strengths and assets, which is, it is absolutely true to say, as he often says when he's asked about this issue, as he did with me, he is a long-established anti-racist and anti-racism campaigner. It is true to say that he has campaigned against anti-racism all of his political life. It's completely true. But of course, two things can be true at once. That is true. It can also be true, and this is the bit where Mr. Corbyn demurs and dislikes, it can also be true that that very fact in some way occasionally blinded him to some of the stories which existed at that time. The very fact that he was so anti-racist, he couldn't quite see that there were things that happened under his leadership that were deeply problematic in racial terms and in anti-Semitic terms, and he just couldn't quite bring himself to see it. So I think those two things in a way reinforced each other.
What could the long-term fallout from this be? Because it could result in Labour losing Islington North at the next election. If there's an official Labour candidate and Jeremy Corbyn and a Conservative and a Liberal Democrat, it's entirely possible to imagine that one of the Conservative, well, probably the Liberal Democrat, could come through the middle there. And that obviously would be, if Labour's looking to govern with a majority, they can't afford to lose even one seat like that, can they?
No, they certainly can't. It'd be quite a thing, a Conservative gain on election night in Islington North, or Liberal something that no one quite sees something. But you're absolutely right. Of course, it could happen, because there's no doubt. Look, Jeremy Corbyn, whatever you think about him, I don't think even his worst detractor would say that he is anything other than a pretty assiduous MP for Islington North. He's been the MP there since 1983. I think he's the 7th, 8th, 9th longest serving MP in Parliament altogether. And he takes his constituency responsibilities extremely seriously and always has done. And he does have a very strong following as a result of that very long-standing association with the constituency and his enormous name.